Okay, still no?
Yeah, now we can see it. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and I was thinking, as Milda mentioned, my background is more of that in academia. I'm now currently doing my master's in European and Russian studies at Yale. And as someone who kind of, as someone who made this transition from being very much a political science person, now moving into history, I kind of racked my mind a bit of what could I share from my own work and my own research that could be applicable to the world of debating, but would also kind of speak to the current moment. And so as a student, I mostly work on the history of empire and seeing how empire um, how people negotiated their own agency within the empire. I mostly work on Imperial Russia in the very late 19th century, early 20th century, and kind of challenge this dichotomy between complete freedom and complete subjugation, and see how personal agency can come into play and how people, made their lives and advance their interest, even within those very imperial and very rigid structures. So, but I realized that maybe, a very granular knowledge of history might not be of great use or potentially never of interest to most of you. So I thought, but maybe we can talk about empire and its afterlives and how we can make sense of these historical or even modern day empires and see how we transform societies and how can we kind of make sense of the realities that these empires create. Um, and as of recently, I'm also thinking about this term post-coloniality, which I think most of you have heard before. It's usually not really applied to Eastern Europe. It is something that is usually applied to old Western, the spaces that were colonized by what we call old West European empires, especially relating to the sea conquest by the British or the French or the Spanish. And but as of recently, more what I'm noticing more and more. Okay, perfect. What I'm starting to notice recently is to kind of see this language of decolonization and post-coloniality being applied to Eastern Europe. And I think it will be no secret that this conversation or this narrative was, of course, very much a response to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And then you could kind of see this impetus to decolonize Eastern European studies, leaving these more academic, scholarly spaces and entering public discourse. So you have projects by libraries and museums talking about decolonizing, how we see culture in Eastern Europe. You also have academic institutions who are trying to maybe think about ways they're teaching and producing knowledge about Eastern Europe and what imperial biases might be encoded in that. So we know that Davis Center at Harvard, which is kind of this regional center for Russian Eastern European studies, launched a series about kind of really looking through their curriculum and the way university structures educational curriculum and ask questions. Maybe there are some implicit Russian-centric narratives that kind of leave other communities in the region unrepresented. But to kind of really trace this narrative of decolonization and how it's applied to Eastern Europe, the phenomenon is actually not new. And in academic circles, it started in early 1990s. And it's kind of, in academia, it's known as the imperial turn. So scholars, especially in the West, Western institutions, we woke up in 1991, Soviet Union collapsed, and now we saw that Soviet Union, 15 republics emerged from the Soviet Union, and many people realized that they don't know anything about those people, and no one really studied their languages, no one really explored these regional differences, and Soviet Union was mostly perceived as the space where people speak Russian, and this ideology of Marxist-Leninism was kind of this overpowering framework, which really obscured the vision of difference. So already in 1990s, you could kind of see this slow movement towards thinking about Eastern Europe and especially the post-Soviet space as a product of empire, and the empire which was kind of tied together by these connections of domination. But I think it was really until 2022, then this conversation of decolonization really exited this very sheltered ivory tower of academia and started making headway into the public space and public conversation. So, and as I was thinking, okay, so, but is decolonization and the afterlives of empire relevant for debating world? Because I'm a bit of a retired debater, not gonna lie. So I don't have a very good grip on kind of the on the topics that are important in the debating world. So what I did, I looked up the most recent or couple of years of WSDC motions, and I saw, is there some sort of conversation happening in the debating world that would reflect this kind of movement or that would reflect this ongoing conversation about post-coloniality, empire across the globe. And I found this motion. So this was WSDC 2021 quarterfinals, and the info slide read: during and after colonization, local elites prefer to be educated in European languages and or in European universities/cities. As part of this education, Western culture and etiquette became the dominant norm in the institutions of a country: civil service, government, education system, etc. And the motion read, this House regrets the westernization of the elites in post-colonial countries. So here you kind of have this toolkit of all the terminology that I would like to talk to you about today. So you have the notion of colonialism and what it does, and kind of its transformative effects on the community. You also have a notion of westernization, of this dominant metropole or imperial central culture that permeates these societies. And then you also have an element of local agency, right? People were not just, as I mentioned, even in the most exploitative and belittling systems, people practiced agency and made choices. And I think this motion also refers to that. So then I think by finding this motion, I was, okay, like I had a moment of ease. I was like, okay, so there is this conversation about, even in debating world, what empire does to communities and how we can make sense of these infrastructures of imperial power, and then how can we make sense of the aftermaths and the transformation that empires leave behind, and how they actually maybe never even leave. So for today, I have a couple of guiding themes. So the way I envision this workshop, I think my intention is to provide you with some of the very broad theoretical concepts, and also recommend you books, because I possibly cannot do justice on the very rich literature on the theories of decolonization and post-colonial theory. There's an incredible body of literature. Even in the case of Eastern Europe, there's also a lot of interesting thinking happening, and scholars are writing as we speak. So I think I cannot possibly kind of do a very comprehensive deep dive into all this academic discourse. But I think what I can do is to introduce or clarify some main concepts, definitions, then recommend some very seminal works, which if you're interested, I would highly, highly recommend you to read. And then maybe then think about how this discourse of empire, colonialism, post-coloniality can be useful in understanding Eastern Europe. And what even is the merit of applying this terminology that was usually reserved to, as I mentioned, spaces in the global South, colonized by the Western European projects. Is this some sort of competition of suffering? We're trying to maybe appropriate the suffering of the people which Eastern Europeans sometimes engage in orientalizing abusive practices themselves? Is it truly a language and way to speak and understand the current moment and the societies in Eastern Europe and beyond, and maybe find some mutual understanding between different modes of domination? So I think I would like to explore that. And then lastly, I would like to, I know that this will kind of the 2/3 of the workshop will be a bit more theoretical. So then for the last part, I would like to kind of tie everything in one case study, which is very close to home. I would like to talk about Latvia and Estonia, and Russian speakers in those countries, and how truly the post-colonial condition really unfold in those places so close to where we are all from. Okay, so after a very lengthy and a bit rambly introduction and setting up the scene, let's talk about empire. So when people usually bring up the empire or the empires, what kind of a conventional concept is this world map before World War I, where you have the world divided by mostly Western European, and then Americans also emerged with their own imperial ambitions in the late 19th century. And so the era before World War I was known as the Age of Empire. So the empire was the signifier of modernity, of progress. If you wanted to be an advanced European nation, you had to colonize. That was kind of the regrettable mentality of it. And the language that is usually described, that is usually used for this period, is the scramble. So scramble for Africa. You're kind of there's this imperial competition, and European countries are competing for the overseas territories. And if you look at this map, you kind of see the magnitude of it. The most of the world is truly under some sort of system of domination. I think this map is not perfectly accurate, because if you look in the South America, those countries became technically independent over the course of 19th century, but they're still experiencing especially economic imperialism of many European countries. So you truly see that how empire was truly overtaking the European map, but also the way people thought about global politics and international order. But then usually in the Age of Empires, when people speak about the colonial imperial project, what people usually have in mind are the sea empires. And kind of among the historians, there is this little joke that if you didn't have ships, it wasn't colonialism. So in a sense, there is some sort of this definition of empire is shaped. I see Rokas is laughing. Okay, good. The historian jokes are are finding their audience. So I think because of this conception that the sea empires were quote unquote the most successful in colonizing because of those ships and because they could reach the most remote territories and establish control over these overseas territories. This notion of empire was kind of most informed by British, French imperial projects. But I think as of recently, and especially after World War I, when you have this great fall of empires, although only 3 empires fell, that being Russian Empire, Austrian Empire, and Ottoman Empire, while British, French, Italians kept their colonies and kept exerting these colonial ambitions. You kind of see that the term of empire took on many different meanings or many different interpretations. So just kind of on the whim, I tried to come up with a couple examples of how empire was famously used in the context that kind of goes beyond this World War I old empire conception. And the first thing that comes to mind is Ronald Reagan's speech about the evil empire. So in 1983, Ronald Reagan was talking to his probably favorite audience, the evangelicals, and kind of trying to truly make this point of why the United States is so invested in the Cold War and standing up to the Soviet Union, especially in the context of war in Afghanistan, which the United States got involved in 1980s. Reagan famously described the Soviet Union as the evil empire. And kind of the implicit connotation behind the speech was that if Soviet Union is the evil empire, that means that there is a good empire, and that being the United States. So kind of establishing this dichotomy between the good and evil, and these imperial projects are competing between these two very esoteric notions of good and evil. And then I think in the same vein, José Barroso, who was the president of a European Commission, I think from 2004 to 2014, famously called European Union the non-imperialist empire. And in Reagan lines, he said, well, European Union has certain aspects or features of empire, but it's not imperialist because it does not expand through coercion. So in his mind, there is this notion of benevolent empire, which might have, some centralized decision-making, eliminating certain features of local decision-making from spaces that become incorporated into this super national project, but it's benevolent. So I think from these kind of anecdotal examples, you can see how empire and the discourse of empire and what even is empire has become quite flexibly used over the years, and has been even reimagined as something that maybe is positive, or something that we can all aspire to become a part of the European empire. So now, kind of maybe just let's go back to a bit more not objective definitions, but I think more widely accepted definitions of empire. And then when people talk about empire, they usually also talk about colonialism and imperialism. And from my experience, these two terminologies are, these two definitions and two concepts are very much conflated and sometimes used interchangeably. Although I do think that there is a slight difference between those two, and I think it might be helpful for you to kind of ponder about the different modalities of empire and relations of domination. So then I think the most conventional definition of empire is that it's a political entity that is expanding its territory through conquest. So there is the element of violence in this process. And then empires impose hierarchical control over subjugated populations. So, for example, French in French Algeria, Algerians were not did not get the same citizenship or were not subjected to the same political regime, legal regime as, let's say, French citizens living either in Algeria or in metropole France. So kind of there's this clear hierarchy between who is in power. And then empire kind of rules through the centralized authority in the imperial center, also known as metropole, and kind of vertically passes down authority rules down to the subjugated populations. And then empires can maintain domination over kind of through many different means. So it can be militarily, establishing military presence on the ground. It can be economic domination. It can be also some administrative practices. So then we talk about colonialism. What people usually have in mind is settler colonialism. So people moving and settling in conquered territories overseas, and then historically, mostly Europeans, settling and imposing control by being physically present in those spaces. So it's usually this is how it usually settlements in North America, Australia, New Zealand, Algeria are described. And as I mentioned, it's usually colonialism is the language that is usually applied to sea empires. Imperialism, on the other hand, technically denotes exerting this domination and control without physically settling in those territories. So the best case, I think, would be the Scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. And the reason why colonizers chose not to settle in certain territories was usually very diverse. So it could be one popular argument is that Europeans selected locations based on best weather, and if there was the climate was not such prone to disease, and it also depended on the resources that the colonizers seek to exploit, and if it required their physical presence there. And I think the theory of imperialism and kind of this definition of imperialism being something broader than just settlers coming in and imposing very much direct control was actually advanced by Lenin. And even now I'm in this class called Empire and Anti-Imperialisms. And the first kind of the most monumental or like seminal work that you're forced to read, I think the very first class is Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. So Lenin in 1917, kind of observing this World War I, the age of empires, global situation, and his read on it was that colonialism and empire, as we usually talked about it, does not really encompass everything what is happening, and that economic domination is also one of the very powerful tools that these imperial projects use to exert control. So Lenin was kind of the big advocate of not even talking about political motivations for imperialism, and for him it was all economic. So that's kind of the big. This is where this notion of imperialism as being something very broad and kind of dispersed and omnipresent structures of domination comes from. And then I think colonialism is also can also be tells the story of generating difference, and how this Western Europeans rationalized what they were doing in these very remote territories, imposing control over people who really did not want the Europeans to be there. And what you kind of see in also late 19th century coming into the stage, or the European mind, how it's usually sometimes put, is that the metropole and these Western European countries, which at the same time locally and domestically are undergoing the process of liberalization and embracing liberal ideas. So you had first parliaments being established around Europe. You kind of have this transformation from subjects to citizens, where I know British, French, German, Austrian local populations for the first time got rights to, I don't know, vote, access legal system. You have this notion of rights, that people deserve certain rights. But at the same time, so while these European powers are undergoing this process of embracing liberalism and liberal ideas at home, they're exerting this unprecedented extra-legal violence overseas. And this caused some tension. People were like, okay, this something is not really aligning here. And to kind of alleviate this cognitive dissonance, in the late 19th century, as a part of this colonial empire project, you have the construction of difference starting to take place. So Europeans had to invent some sort of rationalization why we have to, respond or be more benevolent to our own domestic populations. We can be very cruel to peoples overseas. And this difference was usually based on the invention of race, religion, culture, and this entire narrative of empires bringing the gift of civilization to people, because those people are quote unquote inferior, and then the Europeans need to come and enlighten them. So I think for me, it was very interesting to understand that race or these cultural differences, they're not always present in the minds or theories of these Western Europeans. And it's truly the development of late 19th century and kind of responding to this tension between liberalism at home and the violence and injustice being inflicted overseas, and how these European imperial projects try to reconcile the two. So kind of responding to the Age of Empires after World War One, the empire continues, especially in the global South. And even after World War II, right? The West emerges, or the democracy emerges victorious from this fight of totalitarianism and fascism. But empire persists, and freedom and whatever big words were used in the celebratory moment did not apply to the actual majority of the world. And so then in the aftermath of World War II and starting with 1950s, you have thinkers emerging in these European colonized spaces who start thinking about liberation and thinking about decolonization, and how the principles of rights, of political participation should be applied globally. And one of the thinkers that I think made way in the most profound way to this decolonization discourse was Frantz Fanon. So Frantz Fanon was born in French Caribbean and was educated within these imperial institutions. And as a very talented student, he became a psychiatrist. And writing in 1950s, and as someone being very interested in the mind and how people make sense of themselves, their environment, he started writing about this condition of coloniality and what colonialism does to local people and local subjectivity. And Frantz Fanon was the first one to kind of articulate that colonialism transforms the identity of subjects. It's not just something that happens and can be immediately reversed. It transforms societies. So he talked about this trauma of being immersed in this cultural framework where some people from the outside come, exploit your resources, subjugate you to violence, but even more profoundly, they create this framework that pathologizes your own local identity and your own local subjectivity. So Fanon wrote a lot about race and how French created this racial difference, and which also transformed how colonial populations saw themselves. And he also wrote a lot about violence and liberation. So Frantz Fanon was not a pacifist. He kind of theorized that colonial projects began with violence. So there was this original violence that established this colonial control, and only through violence and violently overthrowing these regimes of subjugation, local populations can come together, develop national identity, the sense of belonging. So I think this is also an interesting analysis about violence and the role of violence in that in the process of liberation. So with Frantz Fanon in 1950s, we kind of we are starting to have this conversation about what coloniality does to people, and kind of try to analyze and better understand the effects of these imperial projects. And then starting with 1960s, the age of decolonization, where the Western European empires are finally losing control over their overseas territories, and countries in the global south are declaring independence. It kind of seemed like, okay, so if countries are, if former colonial control is eliminated, then maybe this is it. we are done with empire, and now the world is truly free. And of course, scholars looking at the situation that was unfolding realized that that's not necessarily the case. And another kind of very important work was written by Edward Said in, I think, 1972, I want to say. And Edward Said took, of course, a very academic perspective on this moment after the formal colonization, and talked about how the empire continues even after the formal imperial overlords give up control. And he looked at the production of knowledge. And his case study is mostly Middle East. And he basically characterizes the production of knowledge. So the way we write books and the way we analyze societies, the way we conduct anthropology, the way we write history, and how that production of knowledge is, first of all, signifies power, and depending on who has this power to produce this knowledge, it can be used to perpetrate the same logic of subordination and maintain and give justification to continued exploitation of these territories that are now formally free, but are still very much tied to their former colonial/imperial overlords through economic relations and things like that. So I think these two books kind of truly set the discourse about colonization and post-coloniality, which of course have only developed, and more things have been said since these two seminal works in 1950s and 1970s. So now, after going through this more of a academic or a conceptual framework of what was originally described as post-colonial space, and what was originally described as colonialism and imperialism. Now, I would like to transition to thinking about how these frameworks can be applied to Eastern Europe, and especially when talking about the Soviet Union. And I think you would agree with me that there was a general hesitancy, or actually, in most cases, unwillingness to claim colonization or post-coloniality as productive terms to describe Eastern Europe. And I think the first sign of this is that usually in Eastern Europe, when you talk about the countries that emerged from the Soviet Union, you usually talk about occupation. So I think this is the Lithuania is the par excellence case. Like, I don't think you can find a single history textbook that would say that. Okay, maybe now there could be one, but at least from my experience, like, I have never encountered the Soviet occupation of Lithuania in 1940 or 90, and then the second one as being colonization. And I think there is a reason for this choice of words, and I think it kind of the main thing that underlies it is that occupation generally signifies some sort of fossilization, right? So occupier comes, this is big national disaster. Occupier comes, removes your local agency, but doesn't really transform anything. So it's kind of this yoke of empire coming, absorbing you, and then retreating. So I think then, especially in the case of the Baltics, then the Baltics talk about occupation. The implicit argument here is that we had our own statehood in interwar years. Then we got unfairly occupied and subjected to this unlawful regime, but then the regime fell, and then we just went back to our tradition of statehood that existed in the interwar republic in the interwar years. And I think it's very telling that this hesitancy to use colonization as the mental framework to understand the Soviet regime, because many European, especially Soviet republics that were kind of located more on the European side of Soviet Union, we also engage in some sort of orientalizing rhetoric, especially when it comes to Russia. So you can see a lot of kind of talk about Russia being Asiatic, or Russia being of lower culture, not Catholic, for example. That's a popular trope as well. And in a sense, there is this uncomfort of how can you be colonized by this inferior civilization, this inferior polity. So I think it's a very interesting moment how both being subjected to these relations of domination does not prevent people from engaging in orientalization and engaging in kind of establishing these hierarchies, even if they're not physical but rather mental, and othering the polity that is encroaching on you. Then I think the second argument why only as of recently the Soviet project was not described as imperial was that the underlying basis for the Soviet project was this, on paper, very universalizing and emancipatory ideology. So Soviet Union did a lot of great propaganda work, and I think it was always performative, but in some historical cases, it truly unfolded in practical benefit, where the Soviet Union tried to establish itself in the opposition to this quote-unquote free world by revealing the contradictions of this free world, especially when it came to the global South. So the Soviet Union was very active, especially in Africa and Southeast Asia, kind of making inways and showing and taking this role of being this emancipatory power that can help these post-colonial spaces to negotiate and resist the encroachment of the West. So then I think if you have this formal rhetoric and kind of this identity of standing up for the spaces and peoples in the global South, then I think it was very difficult for scholars, especially in Western institutions, who spend a lot of time thinking about Western imperialism and Western structures of domination. It was very difficult to kind of recalibrate or redefine Soviet Union as both someone who professed these universalizing emancipatory ideology and was actively involved in liberation movements and in the global South, as also the project, as also the imperial project, which practiced domination itself. So kind of this flip side of things, where you can both be emancipatory and universalizing in certain cases and imposing domination at the same time. And then I think another complication why it's kind of difficult, or sometimes things get murky when we talk about the Soviet Union as the empire, is this question between the relation between totalitarian regime an empire, and is very different. So when it comes to when we talk about totalitarian regimes, we usually have this the kind of the matter of fact is that within these structures, personal agency is basically non-existent, and kind of this state apparatus encompasses and encroaches on all facets of human life. And I think in the Soviet Union, I think many, almost barely anyone would disagree that it was a totalitarian regime. And so maybe the more, and maybe then there is not a conversation to be had about the imperial aspects of this regime. Maybe it was just a totalitarian regime, which just subjugated all the people equally, living in the Soviet Union. And I think I don't know. I think this is a very interesting way to think about regime and empire. I do think that traditionally, when you had those old European empires, let's say French, right? So French people living in Algeria or metropole France, they enjoyed political liberties, freedoms, electoral politics, while colonial subjects did not enjoy the same privileges. In the Soviet Union, you could make an argument that everyone was subjugated in the same way. No one truly enjoyed the luxury of rule of law, electoral politics, electoral representation, and sometimes in the kind of scholarly discourse, you can see this notion of internal colonization. So in a sense, if the regime is so evil, you kind of colonize yourself. But at the same time, the Soviet Union had this element of territorial expansion. If you talk about Imperial Russia, you also had this element of imperial expansion. And this expansion was usually violent. So how can you think about the oppressiveness of a regime and kind of the widespread oppression or undifferentiated oppression at the same time talking about empire? So I think this also kind of obscures our ability to talk about Soviet Union as the empire. And then I think the last impediment for to clearly make the case for Soviet Union as the empire is this notion of obscured metropole and obscured othering practices. So what was the imperial center of the Soviet Union? I think we all would intuitively say the Moscow, things in Moscow. And then the decisions were led down from the center down to all the spaces across the empire. But who could join the metropole, or who could join the Politburo, the highest echelons of the political party, which then signified this highest degree of power? And then I think the answer gets a bit murky, right? Was it just the Russians? Well, not really, right? Stalin was Georgian, a very good ideologue and a very cruel man, but a Georgian. And he made it to the top. And you can think about Nikita Khrushchev, right? From Ukraine. Was a good party member, devout communist, made it to the top and got the license to be in power. So then there is the question, okay, so can anyone become the part of this power structure, this metropole at the top? And then how is the empire imposing hierarchy? If it's not based on nationality, as we would say, and is rather, framed as a class thing, So the Soviet Union can repress you, can send you to lock you up in prison or mental hospital because you are not ideologically aligned. Does that constitute the empire? Does that constitute a certain hierarchy? And I think this is also the problem why Soviet Union can be was not a very intuitive case for talking about colonialism and coloniality. But at the same time, I think now there is more and more research coming forth about how the Soviet practices of kind of this class othering and saying, okay, you're the enemy of the people because you belong to this exploiters class, was usually used to cover up eliminating people whom the Soviet regime deemed untrustworthy or potentially rebellious, and those categories usually overlapped with being of non-Russian ethnicity, being Tatar, being Muslim. So I think this is kind of this obscurity of what is the premise of a hierarchy that the Soviet Union operated on. But people have, despite of these kind of potential difficulties in placing, in a very conventional sense, Soviet Union in this category of empire, who is colonizing other territories, scholars have thought about this, about applying colonial discourses to the post-Soviet space, and kind of now I'm slowly transitioning to the truly the case of the Baltic studies. So there are two books that I recently read, and I don't think they're. I think they're kind of in existent opposition. So I think that's why it's an interesting parallel to talk about. But of course, for now there are more and more works who talk about coloniality and the Soviet system. So the first book, published by the Estonian scholar Annus, I think in 2016, kind of tries to make the case that the Baltic states is post-colonial. And the way she tries to do that is kind of going through the checklist. Okay, so did Soviet regime practice hierarchical power? Check. Where was the element of settler colonialism in Soviet Union? If yes, check. Was there, an element of violence and repression? Check. So she basically kind of does this overview of just constituting the fact and saying, yes, we should include the post-Soviet space because it meets all these whatever attributes of empire, and hence we get the license to talk about the post-Soviet space as post-colonial. And I think it's a useful read to kind of see how Soviet system is theorized, especially from the perspective of the periphery. But I don't think it truly. It doesn't truly go into the complexities and kind of acknowledging that the Soviet Union was a bit different than the old European empires. And I don't think Annus really allows herself to go into these complexities and kind of working with these contradictions. But it was kind of the first work that truly put the Baltic states into this matrix of meaning making based on post-coloniality and post-colonial theory. And then the second book which I think is a bit more nuanced. It was written by one of my favorite professors at UPenn, Professor Platt. It came out, I think, only last year, and it's called Borderline Conditions: Russian-Speaking Latvians Between World Orders. And Platt, kind of very much in dialogue with Ep An's book, makes this his intervention and saying, rather than talking about certain space as post-colonial and seeing if it meets certain criteria, and then only if you meet this criteria, then you can claim post-coloniality, and then you can speak about the colonial evil, he reframes the world or the globe as post-colonial. And his argument is basically that coloniality and this idea of hegemons and global domination influenced the world as a whole. And it's not just one specific space over the other, one that suffered from colonialism and others that didn't. His argument is that the entire world order is shaped by these colonial experiences. And so he writes that post-colonial is best conceived not as an exclusive condition, right? So checking the boxes, but as a set of relations inscribed into the present by global histories of empire and domination. So now this is a bit abstract. So I welcome you to the case study, which I think also underlies a lot of Platt's book. So what are these relations that denote or can reveal coloniality and the way coloniality structures our societies? And I think one powerful case is that of the Russian speakers in Latvia and Estonia. So I don't know how much people are familiar with this. It might be something that is, like something that you heard many times, but I think it's still a powerful illustration. So before Estonia and Latvia got occupied by the Soviet Union, the Russian-speaking population in those countries were less than 10%. So I think in Latvia it was 7%, in Estonia it was maybe 9%. And actually, despite of both Latvia and Estonia, as Lithuania, in the late years of interwar period, succumbing to authoritarian regimes, both Latvia and Estonia actually had very liberal or great institutional framework for minority protection. So there is now a very interesting case study showing how Estonian constitution was probably one of the most progressive. Estonian interwar constitution as being one of the most progressive in terms of minority protection, providing cultural autonomy, providing schools to groups of different linguistic, ethnic backgrounds. So this is kind of the situation before this Soviet imperial project comes around. And then in 1990s, if you look at the population or demographic composition of Estonia and Latvia again, you see that it has been transformed. So in Latvia, you have almost 50% of the population being Russian-speaking. In Estonia, the percentage is 35%. In Estonia, the Russian speakers are more concentrated in certain areas. So in Narva, for instance, and all in the eastern part of the country, this is the space where the Russian speakers concentrated. While in Latvia, we were kind of more intermixed and lived everywhere, basically. And then people looking at the statistics were usually then automatically raising the question, so is it settler colonialism? is it, and again, thinking about the post-Soviet space as the post-colonial space, saying, okay, you clearly see that there was a movement of people. The movement was mandated by the imperial or the metropole, which is, we agreed, is potentially Moscow and the Politburo. And that's where you kind of have this conversation. Okay, so it is a post-colonial situation. I think we can complicate this analysis also a bit. People knowing at least one person who actually lived in the Soviet period know how people truly had very limited agency in terms of where they wanted to live. So there was the system of propiska in Soviet Union, where your kind of permit where you were allowed to live was kind of mandated by the central structures of the party. So people who would graduate university, let's say you were a refrigerator engineer, you were graduating, I don't know, university in Tashkent, and then you could be mandated to go and work in Latvia because there was a new refrigerator factory opening up there, and they needed expertise. So it was kind of not really a personal agency. At least in some cases, it was not a personal agency of people to move and settle in areas which we were not from. But there was this element of the state structures deciding the movement of people and where people would settle. So after the Baltic states gained independence, Estonians and Latvians were confronted with this difficult dilemma. You have the composition of a society transformed over the course of 40 years, 50 years of the Soviet rule, and now you somehow need to go back to the interwar tradition of statehood. You need to govern. You need to vote on in the independence referendum. So basically, what do you do with those Russian speakers? And Lithuania, I must say, did not have the same problem because we just did not have such big movement or migration of Russian speakers. And I think by the time of independence, our Russian-speaking population was maybe 15%, and then they had way more Poles and people who identified as Polish-speaking. So Lithuania adopted what is called the zero-option citizenship. So whoever was living in Lithuania at the time of March 11th, 1990, everyone got citizenship. While Latvia and Estonia took a different path. And they legally, they said that they're reinstating the citizenship law that existed in pre-Soviet interwar Latvian and Estonian republics, basically saying that only people who resided in Latvia or Estonia before 1940 and their ancestors can claim Latvian or Estonian citizenship. And of course, this law immediately excluded the great majority of Russian speakers who moved to Latvia and Estonia after they were integrated into the Soviet Union. And basically, why they did this? They did not want Russian speakers to vote. That was the main reason. They deemed them untrustworthy or people with mixed loyalties. And I think now people are trying to I think now people are not really contesting that it would have been very difficult for Latvia and Estonia to go and proceed on this path of independence while having to find meanings of belonging with these populations that did not share or were not really excited about this, national awakening the ethno-linguistic, ethno-national independent state projects that the Baltic states kind of embarked in late 1990s or in late 1980s. So what Latvia and Estonia invented was, in a sense, the status of non-citizen. In Latvian, it's called nepilsoni. So what is this non-citizen status? You get a passport, which you can see the picture here. It looks very similar to the passport that all Latvians have, but it's not. So you're not allowed to vote on this passport. You get access to all the you can work in Latvia. You can get pension. You're entitled to legal protections, but your passport does not carry the same political representation and is not acknowledged the same way internationally. So, for example, if you are a non-citizen person in Latvia, you cannot enjoy the Schengen area or the Schengen zone as Latvian citizens. So, for example, you cannot go and work in any of the EU country. You need a work visa. I think you can travel everywhere, but only for 90 days or something. So there are very substantial differences in what protections and opportunities these two differentiated citizenship regimes offer. And I think what the most problematic aspect and why this law was heavily criticized was that the kids of non-citizens would inherit the status. So now the law is changed. I think Latvia changed it in 2020, like very, very recently, where we kind of, stopped reproducing the non-citizen, in a sense, stateless population. And now if you're born to non-citizen parents in either Latvia and Estonia, you get they're regular citizens of those two respective countries. So I think when talking about citizenship law, there is this interesting dynamic between occupation and colonization also emerges, right? So those two states say we were kind of reject the fact that their societies have been transformed and irreversibly altered by the Soviet regime. And in a sense, we embrace this rhetoric of occupation. Okay, so we are going back to this fossilized state of affairs that we found ourselves at before the Soviets came. In a sense, we reject to even grapple with the effects of how our societies were transformed by those 50 years of Soviet rule. And I think the citizenship law and this question of Russian speakers in Latvia and Estonia really sheds light on what Kevin Platt talks as relations of post-coloniality and how it can be riddled with contradictions. So Latvia and Estonia excludes Russian speakers from getting citizenship, in a sense, from being full members of the civic of a political nation that Latvia and Estonia emerged to become. Then in turn, Russian Federation in early 2000s, observing kind of this very precarious dynamic between the Russian speakers in Latvia and Estonia, announced this initiative and declared Russian speakers in the former post-Soviet space as compatriots abroad. And what Compatriots Abroad initiative denoted was that you could receive funding from the Russian Federation to foster your local Russian-speaking community. There was a lot of money poured into Latvia and Estonia. And of course, some of this money came with strings attached. Some of this money came with, of course, the giant propaganda apparatus that Russia, usually attaches to whatever things it offers. So you kind of see how those people, they're affiliating with this imperialist government that inherited the desire to control the post-Soviet space and impose domination over the territories of the former Soviet Union. But at the same time, these people were victims of statelessness. They were subjected to this differentiated regime of unequal rights and unequal political representation and unequal opportunity. So I think, how do you reconcile that at the same time, some Russian speakers in Latvia and Estonia, truly felt, that the place belonged to them. They were not really interested in local society, local language. They didn't learn the language. And then they were uncomfortable seeing that now those local Latvian and Estonian societies are becoming more assertive and trying to reverse this constellation of power structures. But at the same time, then Latvia and Estonia, in a sense, taking the same instruments of empire, especially like empires have this huge history and huge tradition of differentiated citizenship, as to kind of keep certain populations excluded and subordinated. So how these independent Latvian Estonian projects took these instruments and applied it to the former agents of empire, if you can call them that. I think this is a bit maybe a bit scandalous. But so I think just by showing this case, I think it truly speaks how post-coloniality is relational, and how post-coloniality can be is not a stagnant condition, but rather is the relationship of power and influence, and how both colonizer and colonized can overlap and can shift dynamics. And I think if you truly want to talk about post-colonial societies and the afterlives of empire, we really should take into consideration that these relationships are not stagnant and they can change hands, and how truly the post-colonial frameworks influence not just certain places in the world that tick all the boxes, but it's more about this conversation of power, influence, inclusion, and exclusion. And if we want to do justice to this, to applying post-colonial framework to Eastern Europe, but I think all across the globe, I think the honest conversation about difference and nuance is also very important. Okay, I will stop ranting, and then maybe we can chat and have questions.